Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the First Great Awakening in our continuing study of the history of Christianity. The Great Awakening is going to see the colonies. Remember that you didn't have a country of the United States of America yet. Those were just British colonies. The English Puritans in the North had a congregational form of church government. That is, the people had a big say in the way things operated. Think about the other end of the spectrum. That would be a episcopal form of church government, like the Roman Catholic Church, like the Church of England, which is episcopal in form. And then a middle way might be the Presbyterian form of government, where elders are selected, but then they actually make decisions and they rule. So congregational form of government, just like it sounds, the congregation is making a lot of the decisions. Now, they really didn't have much in the way of religious toleration. Sometimes we get the idea that the the colonists who had come over from England came over to this country so that they could have religious freedom. Well, they wanted freedom from the Church of England, but that wasn't that they wanted everybody else to have religious freedom. So they really didn't want to see a bunch of different denominations grow up among them. They had committed themselves to reforming the church, and they wanted to make sure it stayed reformed. Now, there were actually laws against blasphemy and breaking the Sabbath if you didn't show up to church on Sunday. And when I say Sabbath, I'm not talking about the Jewish practice of resting on Saturday, which, by the way, I think is a good thing. But Christians from the very early days of the church had made it their practice to meet um, and to worship the Lord on the first day of the week. Don't know if we even really talked about that in this particular series of classes, but that's just simple history, and that's true. But notice the Puritans had actually not just said you should do this, from the pulpits of the church, but their governmental authorities actually had laws on the books, and you could be punished for verbal blasphemy, for breaking the Sabbath. You could actually end up with a fine or maybe even be arrested or something like that. Education had always been emphasized among the Puritans because remember, they were people of the book. It was all about let's go back to the scriptures and see what they have to say so that we can purify the church, so we can take it back to its first century roots. Not that we have to live like everybody in the first century, but we want to be purists. We want to put aside all of the traditions of man that have come along over the last 1600 years by that time. And so they emphasized education, and there was a very high degree of literacy among the Puritans, really almost universal literacy. Harvard, the College of Harvard, was started in 1636 to train ministers. I suspect it has deviated somewhat from that original prospect. Now, one of the religious groups that's going to be persecuted, started by George Fox. This is the Religious Society of Friends. He was a shoemaker, and he felt like he had sort of had or experienced an inner light, a presence of God. We would say maybe he, and I'm not sure if he used these terms, born again. Uh, and he rejected, as did the Puritans, all outward rituals. Now, I think he goes a bit beyond them, but rejects all outward rituals, adopts a philosophy of pacifism. Now, the Puritans, whatever you say about them, they weren't pacifists. They thought that I should try to live peaceably with my neighbor, but if that doesn't work out, then God doesn't give the sword in vain, and sometimes he calls us to warfare. And Fox says, no, no, no. Jesus said, turn the other cheek. And Fox felt that Jesus wasn't just talking about what you do personally, but that applies to what you do as a government. Now, he's not in charge of any government, so that's, what he thinks about that isn't really moving anybody to do anything as far as passing a law or anything like that. And he's going to um, grow a number of followers, and they will be known as the Quakers because of, they don't give themselves this name, but because of the tendency among some of them as they are praying, they get so involved in capturing that inner light, seeking that spiritual experience, that they would quake, that they would move, that they would have some sort of outward manifestation of that. The persecution in Massachusetts, and you're seeing actually an illustration from the era. Notice where Quakers are being either flogged or put into the stocks. That the stocks would be some sort of physical restraint where they wouldn't be able to either scratch their nose, or very uncomfortable. And it was designed to be. Finally, it was William Penn who had established the colony of what would eventually become Pennsylvania, and he was governor of that. And he gave them a place to stay without persecution. Not, you see, you didn't have the same policy in each of the states. Sometimes you would have a colony. When I say states, colonies, I should say. Uh, some colonies had a legalized. This was the religion of that colony, and woe be to you if you didn't follow that, if you wanted to profess something else. But he had brought about in Pennsylvania um, in a system where there would be no persecution, no matter what you believe, no matter how you worship the Lord. Now, next I want to look at Solomon Stoddard. His life spans the era from the 1600s to the 1700s. He was the pastor of the Congregational Church in Northampton, Massachusetts. Northampton is way to the west of Boston, so it's not near Boston. We're going to see some other churches that are in the Boston area. He was the pastor for 55 years. That's a long and distinguished career. Very plain spoken sermons, easy to understand that he would preach. And he had brought about, or allowed to bring about at least, what was called the halfway covenant. You see, there are those who had made a profession of faith and they had trusted in Jesus, their Lord and Savior, and they were members of the church. But the Lord's Supper now was being given under Stoddard, not just to believers, or excuse me, not just to members, but even to those members who were, or not members, those people who were believers, but not members of his church. They perhaps had not gone through a catechism training, and but they were saying, "I believe in Jesus," and he said, "That's enough. That's good enough. You can come and partake of the Lord's Supper." So that's part of the halfway covenant. The other part is that he was baptizing children. Now he's not the only people to do that. You can go back to Calvin and Luther and folks like that that were saying yes. Remember how Jesus had said, or not Jesus, Peter had said on the day of Pentecost, um, repent and be baptized for the remission of your sins for this promise. The next verse, for this promise is to you and to your children. And so they looked at that and other passages in the New Testament that talk about how somebody would believe and their whole family would come and be baptized. And so Solomon Stoddard said, well, because of that, it's appropriate that children be baptized. Not that that's saving them. Now, if they are professing Jesus because they're old enough to do that, that's fine. But even if they're not, if infants are being baptized, that's okay, because the parent is saying that that child is going to be part of my family, and I'm going to train up that child to believe the way I do, and so that I'm going to raise up that child to be a believing child. He saw it as in a sense, a like ceremony, like what you had in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, you have circumcision. Now, circumcision was only for males, but circumcision was supposed to be an outward picture of an inward reality. Remember, all the times the prophets would talk about having your heart circumcised, and they would not withhold circumcision until the person believed. They would say, "No, he's going to be a covenant child. He's going to grow up in the covenant, and then we're going to train him in the way he ought to believe." Stoddard was doing the same thing with Lord's Supper and with baptism. Now, in the Lord's Supper, um, now, he's not having infants partake of that, but he is having believers, even if they're not members. And he's opposed by this practice by increased Mather. And we're going to talk now about increased Mather and the whole Mather family. So he actually gets connected with them, not just in the sense of having conversations. Mather was a pastor in the Boston area, so they're both pastors, but different areas, different locales. And Notice you have this, I put sort of the family because they're going to get connected here. You had Eleazar Mather, and Increase. Increase was a pastor, and as would be his son Cotton Mather. We're going to talk about him next. Um, but when Eleazar Mather died, Elizabeth Solomon Stoddard married Elizabeth, his widow, and nothing wrong with that. But in a sense, they have a loose family connection now. Um, and what's going to happen is that Increase Mather, remember I said he's in the Boston area, he and Cotton would be there. When the Salem witch trials came about, where something like 29 people, don't quote me on the number, but a number of people were hanged. Sometimes we portray the Salem witch trials as taking place where they were burning people at the stake. There were no people burned, at least insofar as I know. They were hanging, and one person, in order to try to get a confession, they put heavy weight upon him until he died. Um, and Increase Mather had actually written. Now he wasn't. He saw these things. He was not a participant in those Salem witch trials. I think he did attend one of the trials. He was aware of that, and he actually wrote a paper saying that you should not be using what was called spectral evidence. Now, spectral evidence meant that maybe somebody would have a dream that so and so had done something, put a hex on them or a spell on them, or some sort of witchery. And so, because of that dream, you say, well, God must have given me that dream, therefore it's true, therefore we're bringing that dream, a report of that dream as evidence in court. So somebody has a dream about you, and all of a sudden you're being called into court and maybe even put to death. And so Increase Mather wrote a paper saying you shouldn't be doing that. And now he's not saying you shouldn't be putting witches to death, shouldn't be hanging people, but you should have better evidence than that, not just the evidence of somebody's dream. And so that was going on at the same time. These gentlemen weren't directly involved in that, although sometimes you look at some of the sermons of Increase Mather as he's talking about fighting against the forces of darkness. Speaking of demons and spiritual warfare, these were some of the topics in the sermons, at least in his sermons. And so he's not, I wouldn't say he's directly responsible for what took place in Salem, but maybe he could have spoken out a little more strongly against some of those practices, perhaps. Now that's a little unfair because I wasn't there, and he wasn't, actually in Salem. He was in the next door district. Now, William Tennant, he's a Scottish Presbyterian, migrates to Pennsylvania in 1718, and he begins the Log College. We already talked about Harvard. The Log College is there to prepare ministers, and it is going to be the forerunner of Princeton. So just as Harvard was erected in order to serve the church and to train up Christian ministers, so also Princeton was what would eventually be Princeton, did the same thing. But the graduates were banned from Presbyterian ministry. There was an issue there, even though Tennant himself was Presbyterian. I'm not sure if they didn't want competition or they felt that this school was a bit too much involved in seeking conversions instead of seeking to give people a much more detailed doctrinal foundation. And I want to be fair to Tennant, but his emphasis seems to be more on the gospel and raising up ministers who are going to spread that gospel instead of all the different realms of Bible teaching. In other words, he tended to focus on the gospel. In a sense, he reminds me a little bit of Luther. Remember, we have contrasted Luther and Calvin, who believed a lot of the same things. But Calvin's focus had been upon glorifying God in all areas, including the gospel. The gospel was very important to him. And Luther said, well, yeah, glorifying God is okay, but let's focus on the gospel. So two different emphases, and I think that's not the only thing, but that's a bit of what we have here. So the terms now are being used of old school, versus New School. Tennant is considered, and his log college, that's considered New School. Fresh ideas and new ways to present Jesus, and they're not trying to present a different gospel. I don't think we can accuse them of that, but still, it made some of the old schoolers a bit uncomfortable. And so, itinerant preaching, in other words, preaching without a church, preaching without a license. You have a license to preach? Yes. Um, that was forbidden by the old school folk. They said, you can't do that. We have to be able to check up on what you are preaching. You might preach the wrong thing. And I sort of get what they were coming from. But, sometimes the Spirit says go, and they go. And so a college diploma was required of ministers. They insisted. Now, later on, we're going to see that changing. That pendulum's going to go back and forth in Christianity. But for a time, a college diploma is required of ministers, and they're not recognizing this particular college. And so the log college isn't recognized, and that's becoming a real division point. Now, we go from William to Gilbert Tennant. He's the son of William Tennant. And we still have this issue in the next generation, the old school versus the new school. And he's a revivalist preacher. And he's preaching against the empty formalism, which I don't think he's just directing his remarks only to the old school, but really they're beginning to resemble that remark. And so he says, look, yes, it's good to have theology, but if it's just theology without connection to Jesus, what good is that? If you have a degree, but you don't have Jesus, what good is that? And so he's going to prepare the way, who we're really going to get to when we come to the First Great Awakening. We're not there yet, for George Whitefield, who's going to be the match that sparks that First Great Awakening. He says, for I am verily persuaded the generality of preachers talk of an unknown and unfelt Christ. In other words, they're preaching, but they don't really know Jesus. And the reason why congregations have been so dead is because they have dead men preaching to them. That's a fitting and appropriate rebuke, if true. Now, in our timeline, notice we go, on this timeline, I'm going all the way back to the 1500s, where Luther's 95 Thesis, and we saw the Reformation beginning to take root here, there, and everywhere, especially in Germany, in the Netherlands, in England with its own variety. Remember, we had the Westminster Assembly, where for a time they were under the Commonwealth, and then we had Spener. Didn't talk about him in this lecture, but a previous lecture, we talked about Spener, the father of modern pietism, and his godson Zinzendorf, sending out missionaries. Already talked about George Fox. The First Great Awakening is going to come in the early to middle 1700s. Notice it parallels with Zinzendorf, but we don't usually equate him with that because he's more on the continent. But we are going to talk about Whitfield, and Whitfield and Wesley are going to be the two big names for the First Great Awakening. So George Whitfield, he had grown up in England, had actually become friends at one point with John and Charles Wesley. They all attended a Bible study that had been started by the Wesleys. So Whitfield is a little bit of a latecomer to that. And he becomes a parish priest. He actually goes to Savannah, Georgia. The Wesleys are in England, so he'd started in England as well. But he returns to England after this, and he becomes an open-air preacher. Remember, open-air preaching was forbidden in certain parts of the colonies, but he's going to be doing it in England. And again, that's frowned on. And the reason he's preaching out in the open air is because they're not letting him into the church, because they feel, well, he's just a little bit too, can I say it this way, too packaged. You see, the clergy, when they would preach their sermons, normally in England and in the colonies as well, would normally stand there and they would read from their notes, and the people would hear and listen. And Whitfield actually had a little bit, he had actually studied acting and things like that. And he would, I'm not saying he would never look at notes, but he didn't appear to. He was, I think, a quick study. And so it looked like he was just preaching extemporaneously. And I think perhaps he was at many times. because you look at not just the many sermons, not just the hundreds, but the thousands of sermons that he's going to end up preaching. And so he accepted the predestination of the 39 articles, going back to an earlier stage of England. And we're going to see that that's going to be a controversy between him and Wesley. We'll come back and address that. Um, he turned the Methodist. He actually is the one who began the Methodist churches, but he wasn't that much of an organizer as Wesley was. And so he turned them over to Wesley, his sort of initially a partner in ministry, but they're going to divide over some theological issues. They'll agree on who Jesus is. They'll agree that Jesus died on the cross for sins, that we trust in him for eternal life. They agree on the gospel, but they are going to have some divisions. And it really comes down to the question of predestination, where Whitfield doesn't try to explain it away. And Wesley says, well, yes, predestination's in the Bible, but God just saw what you would do. So it's not that you're really chosen in that sense. God just chooses the plan of salvation. So they have two different ways of looking at that. And that will cause division between them eventually. Well, you have revival meetings in the Americas that Whitfield is doing all up, and he's tireless, going from one end of the colonies, and I say the Americas, it's not a country yet, from one end of the Americas to the other. He becomes friends with Benjamin Franklin, and Franklin actually comes to hear him preach. Franklin, it is said, would before he would go to hear Whitfield preach, he'd take all the money out of his wallet and leave it back home, lest he be tempted to give money to Whitfield's cause after having heard him preach. And on at least one occasion, he was so moved at the preaching, he says, "Well, okay, I don't have any money, but he goes to a friend. He says, "Will you loan me some money and I'll pay you back?" So he really was impressed with Whitfield. It had been reported that Whitfield at times was preaching to as many as 20,000 people. Now, remember, they don't have microphones or natural amphitheaters where you can do something like that. And Franklin was skeptical. And so, being the sort of scientist that he was, remember, he had an inquiring mind both in politics but in science as well. Remember his studies with electricity. He went to where Whitfield was preaching, but then instead of staying for the sermon, he turned around and left and continued walking away until he could just almost he could still hear what Whitfield was saying, but barely. And then he looked how far he had walked, and he looked at all the people still around him that were listening to the sermon, and he just calculated how many people could be in that like giant crowd, and he concluded, yes, the reports that he was preaching to as many as 20,000 people were true. And Franklin grudgingly admitted, "Wow, that's actually an accurate report." Now, as I said, he preached without notes. I'm not saying he never wrote anything down, but he wouldn't be looking at his notes. He would be looking at his audience, and he would be speaking to them. And sometimes, if he was telling, for example, a Bible story, his voice would get, a bit different as he's sort of reading the part of or telling the part from one character, to another character. Mary said, "Oh, hello," I'm not sure exactly what it would sound like. They don't have it recorded, but that's the way people described it, that he would just pull them into the Bible story where they were feeling like they were part of that. Now, this is very contrary, as I said, to the popular practice. Even some of the preachers that we're going to see that are good and that are going to be also having an impact in the First Great Awakening. Whitfield was sort of unto himself in this. Very Franklin says, in describing Whitfield's preaching, he says, "From being thoughtless or indifferent about religion, it seemed as if all the world were growing religious, so that one could not walk through the town in an evening without hearing psalms sung in different families of every street." So the American colonies had gone from being, yes, they had a religious tradition way back, but suddenly everything just seemed to change. And even a person who was technically not a believer in Jesus, Franklin didn't profess to be a Christian, and yet he talked about it. He says, here's somebody that's making a change. This is really taking place. Whitfield says it's a poor sermon that gives no offense, that neither makes the hearer displeased with himself nor with the preacher. He would preach, yet he wasn't just about preaching to people's minds. He would do that too, but he wanted to preach to their hearts. He wanted to change them. Reminds me of some advice that was given to me as a early Bible teacher, where someone said to me, a wise gentleman, now with the Lord, who said, John, whenever you're teaching, always ask how your students are going to be different when they leave from the way they were when they first came. And Whitfield has that same idea. He wants to change people's hearts. He says, we are immortal until our work on earth is done. Nothing seemed to be able to touch him. He's passionate, he's tireless. I'm sure he did get tired, but he seemed tireless, and he just continues on his ministry, both sides of the Atlantic, going back and forth to England, but especially the colonies, where there wasn't. You see, there's a Wesley over in England. There is not a Wesley, for the most part, in the colonies. Now, he preached to multiracial congregations. This was sort of a new thing, where he did not limit his preaching just to white Anglos. There could be Indians there. There could even be blacks. The settlers, the slave owners especially, tended to frown on telling the blacks about Jesus, at least at this period. Now, that's going to change a bit. It's going to be slow to change. But they frowned on that because they were afraid that the blacks might think, well, gee, if we trust in Jesus and we become brothers in Christ, then you shouldn't have your brother enslaved, and they might want their freedom. And so these slave owners, not everybody owned a slave, but there were people that owned slaves. And let me just say, Whitfield eventually, at one point, he owned slaves as well. Not for his personal aggrandizement, not to just build himself up, but in order to try to support certain ministries. He arranged that. Um, he felt that slavery was something you'd had in the Bible and that it was there, and he actually spoke in favor of that. So he advocated the legalization of slavery in Georgia, in particular. Slavery in Georgia was outlawed in 1735, where there were no new slaves were to be brought in, and then it was legalized. Notice about 20 years later, 25 years later, it was legalized again. 15 years later, excuse me. Um, but he did urge the humane treatment of slaves, that they should be treated, properly, and but he wasn't against slavery. In describing him, Spurgeon has this to say. Spurgeon's a minister from the 1800s. He lived. Other men seemed to be only half alive, but Whitfield was all life, fire, wing, force, as I said, tireless. Now, another character at this time, John Wolman, was a Quaker tailor, also a preacher, and he urged fellow Quakers, when we were talking about slavery, he urged the Quakers to give up their slaves because they had, slavery was a thing that was universal throughout, had been throughout the entire known world. There were people that were slaves, there were people that owned slaves, there were people that didn't because they didn't have the money. Um, and he wrote an article called "Some Considerations on the Keeping of Negroes." It was to call people to rethink this whole slavery idea. The only people that had really done that in the past had been the Irish, who remember with Patrick had said, "Let's not do slavery," and they thought, "Gee, what an idea!" But he writes on this to folk, and we begin to see the birth of abolitionist activities, of those that want to say, let's let's start a movement. Let's get others to free slaves. Now, it's not going to happen yet, at any point at this point, but the idea is going to begin to be floated. And so this is going to have an impact on the Wesleys, not so much on Whitfield, but on the Wesleys. They're going to also come into line with us, that maybe slavery is a bad thing, and maybe we ought to do something different. And they won't succeed in passing the legislation yet, but it's setting the seeds for what's going to happen in the Second Great Awakening. He says, if we, by the operation of the Spirit of Christ, become heirs with him in the kingdom of his Father, and are redeemed from the alluring counterfeit joys of this world, and the joy of Christ remain in us, to suppose that one on this happy condition, for the sake of earthly riches, not only deprive his fellow creatures of the sweetness of freedom, which rightly uses one of the greatest temporal blessings, but therewith neglect using proper means for their acquaintance with the Holy Scriptures. And the advantage of a true religion seems at least a contradiction to reason. So this idea of not just owning slaves, that's part of it, but then taking that ownership and not using that to bring them to Jesus. What's right? There's something wrong with that. And I think Woolman makes an excellent point. Another key player in the First Great Awakening is going to be Jonathan Edwards. And in some ways, he's the polar opposite of Whitfield. If Whitfield was the passionate, fiery preacher, Edwards is the calm, studied pastor. His maternal grandfather was Solomon Stoddard. In fact, he actually was an assistant pastor under his grandfather. So he came into that ministry almost by inheritance and grew up in it. And whereas Whitfield would preach without notes, barely write anything down, sometimes people would take notes and publish those and pass them on. And sometimes they would have, mistakes in them. Where Edwards, by contrast, would write everything out. He would publish pamphlets. We actually have the writing of all of his sermons. And very different. Whitfield is traveling from one end of the colonies to the other, across the ocean and back again. Edwards is just there at Northampton in the church to the way to the west of Boston. And he's there, and the two meet. And Edwards actually allows Whitfield to come in and preach in his church for a Sunday, actually for about 4 or 5 days, um, on a Friday, Saturday, and then on Sunday as well. Um, and he allows him to come in, and he looks at what takes place. Now, he's the senior pastor by this time, where his grandfather's died. Now he's a senior pastor. And revival takes place in Northampton. And yes, Whitfield had been there, but Whitfield's, he's there for a time and then he leaves. Incidentally, it's interesting, as they're together, Whitfield remarks on Edwards, both his sharp mind, but especially he says, one of the things about Edwards is that his wife is such a great help to him. She is winsome and she's intelligent and able to talk about, areas of theology and what's going on. And he says, "Oh, if I could," and now he's not coveting after that person's wife, but he says, "Oh, if God would give me a Rebecca to my Isaac." And because he was single, Whitfield was single. Much later on, he is going to marry, and he will find his Rebecca, and they will live happily ever after. It's going to be a delightful marriage. But he looks to Edwards and his marriage as a model of what a minister should be. And it's just delightful to see their correspondence and to see how they feel about each other. Well, emotional manifestations begin taking place in that church. And Edwards isn't quite sure what to make of it, except that, hey, Jesus has shown up and the Holy Spirit's here. And he hadn't really planned on this sort of thing. He wasn't trying to get people to have this, emotional reaction or go through. But it all begins to take place. And he writes about it in his very logical and very calm. Now he's not always calm in what he writes, but the way he would express it, remember, would be calm and studied. He was the scholar. Probably his most famous sermon, entitled "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," and this is right at the end of the sermon. But remember, he's reading this. He's not standing and screaming it out or anything like that. He says, "Here you are in the land of the living and in the house of God, and have an opportunity to obtain salvation. What would not those poor, damned, hopeless souls give for one day's opportunity, such as you now enjoy?" And people would hear a sermon like this, and they would be weeping and turning to Jesus. And he saw revival taking place within his church and within the area. Now, remember the halfway covenant that Solomon Stoddard had brought about. That halfway covenant that had people come and partake of the Lord's Supper, even if they weren't members, and also baptizing those. Well, he says, that there's a problem there if they're partaking of the Lord's Supper and they're not even believing. You say, well, before they'd been believers, but they're not connected, and we haven't really checked their faith out, and so his elders actually remove him from his church. I said elders, actually. The church says it's a congregational church, um, and he leaves and he takes a church in the town of Stockbridge, even further to the west, that's out on the frontier, and he preaches to the Housatonic Indians. He'd actually expressed years earlier a interest in missionary work and how that ought to be supported. And it's almost though the Lord opens the door for him to go out and engage in exactly that sort of work. He is appointed to be the president of the College of New Jersey, that college that would eventually become Princeton. Um, and before he could take office, he comes down with smallpox. He had been inoculated, and they were still getting the details of how to do inoculations back then. Let me just say, we've gotten a lot better at it. Back then, they would actually take some of the virus and put it in you, and it wasn't necessarily as well measured and as careful. And so they would expose you to a little bit. He got exposed. He contacted the disease, and he died from it. Now, we've seen Whitfield, we've seen Edwards. Next, we want to look at Wesley. And remember, Whitfield and Wesley had known each other from early on. So John Wesley, he had been a friend of George Whitfield. They had a what they called the Holiness Club. It's sort of a Bible study club. They had met together with some other, I imagine, sort of college students. That the Holy Club had been there, and he had been very impressed by the Moravians. Remember, under Zinzendorf, their faith, their prayer, their commitment to eventually to evangelism. Remember how some of them had gone down to the West Indies to preach to slaves down there? And he catches some of that fire and some of that zeal, and he decides that he's maybe ought to be going somewhere and preaching. So he's calling people to be saved, and he says, somebody actually says, "Well, do you know Jesus? Do you know that Jesus has saved you?" And he begins to think, well, do I really know Jesus? It's the sort of thing that Whitfield had commented on, that there were those that were and others previously, that there were those that were ministers of the gospel that didn't know the gospel, that were had been appointed to be leaders in the church and didn't know Jesus. And Wesley asked this of himself, do I really know Jesus? He goes on a mission trip to Georgia. He says, I went to America to convert the Indians. But he asked in the middle of that, but who's going to convert me? Yes, I want to serve Jesus. I want to love him. But do I really know him? I feel like I haven't really connected to Jesus yet. Comes back to England, and he's attending a worship service, and somebody tells him, preach faith until you have it, and then because you have it, you'll preach faith. Did you hear that? In other words, follow Jesus, and even if you don't feel like you've really come into contact with Jesus, follow him anyway. Act like a believer, and then you'll become a believer, and then you'll be able to act like a believer because you'll be a believer. So it's not hypocrisy. It's not saying, pretend, but saying, let your outward body act in faith and call your inner soul to follow along, to be part of that. It's the desire to have faith, and notice you don't just sit in an armchair, a rocking chair, and say, "Well, gee, I want faith. Let me just think about that." But no, get yourself involved. Commit yourself to living in faith, and then have faith. It's a rather interesting approach. He heard a sermon back in England, and he talks about how he says, "My heart was strangely warmed," and he marks this warming of his heart as his conversion experience. He's back in England, and Wesley finds out that he's been excluded from the church. Remember, even though um, he had been cultured and studied, but they don't care for this evangelistic move. They don't care for this new light that he is of which he's become a part. And he says, "That's okay. The whole world is my parish. I don't need to be in a church building to be effective to preach the gospel. I can go anywhere in the world and do that." And so he follows Whitfield in Whitfield's outdoor preaching. Whitfield had already been doing this for years, and Wesley now follows his example. Um, but remember, I said that he embraced the question of Arminianism, the question of predestination, whereas Whitfield had said, "Well, the Bible teaches it. I'm going to go with that." He, on the other hand, embraces Arminianism, the idea that God's predestination was just that God predestined the plan of salvation, that He doesn't actually predestine people, and so he embraces Arminianism, and the two actually write back and forth. I've seen copies. I used to have mine. I don't know what happened to my copies, but I've seen copies of letters that went back and forth between Wesley and Whitfield, and they argue. He got sort of heated at times, and Wesley at one point says, "Well, now I'm not sure if he means this literally or just like I don't want to talk about it anymore." But he says, "I've cast the dice," and sort of might be a throwback to Julius Caesar. I've made my decision, and I'm not going to budge. I've cast the dice, and this is the way it's come out, and so I'm going to be an Arminian. And they don't see eye to eye on that, and their followers actually sort of pit them against each other a little bit, perhaps more than they would have otherwise. Whitfield, in speaking I'm sorry, yeah, Whitfield, in speaking of Wesley, he said, "10,000 times would I rather have died than part with my old friends. It would have melted any heart to have heard Mr. Charles Wesley and me." Now, Charles was the brother of John Wesley. "To have heard Mr. Charles Wesley and me weeping after prayer that if possible the breach might have been prevented." Charles, I think, may have been a little bit of a go-between the two, trying to seal that breach. Um, and they didn't necessarily want it to happen, but it just did. And so we're not going to see them working together anymore. Now, part of that is because remember they're on opposite continents, but Whitfield is going back and forth from England to the colonies. By contrast, and or actually not by, it's not really contrast, it's the same point. Wesley, speaking of Whitfield, and this is he speaks of Whitfield. I think this was after he has already died. His fundamental point was this: give God all the glory of whatever is good in man. Set Christ as high and man as low as possible in the business of salvation. All merit is in the blood of Christ, and all power in and from the Spirit of Christ. This is Wesley, the Arminian, speaking about Whitfield, the Calvinist, and saying he has a good point there. He's not changing his view, but he said he sees the importance of glorifying God, and also of trusting in Jesus completely for salvation. So they both agreed on the gospel. Now, Wesley in 1751, he's in his late 40s, he gets married. I said Whitfield got married, and when he did so, it was to the love of his life, and it was one of those happy ever after stories. Wesley gets married, and unfortunately, it's not a happy ever after story. She's a widow. She's wealthy. I don't know what played into it. I don't know what. I almost want to say I don't know what possessed him. He had been single for his adult life, um, and he continues his travels, around and through England, outdoor preaching, and not much of a home life. And he's married, uh, and he finds himself answering mail from some female admirers, not his wife. Now he doesn't do anything inappropriate with them, but he's corresponding with them, and I sense a bit of jealousy comes to the fore, and eventually they separate. They go through um, a physical, I don't know if it was legal, I don't know if they had legal separations back then, but a physical separation where she goes her way and he goes his. They don't get a divorce. And so when we look at Whitfield and Wesley, Wesley's his marriage life was not a happy one. Whitfield's was. He had looked at Edwards as his role model, and he had found his Rebecca and was very happy. Whitfield the Calvinist, Wesley the Arminian, Whitfield who ministered in America and in England back and forth. I forget how many times he made that journey. Wesley, whose ministry primarily was in England, he had gone to that visit in America to Georgia early in his ministry. Whitfield was primarily an evangelist. Wesley was an evangelist, yes, but he was primarily an administrator. He administrated the growth of the Methodist Church, which is still a sizable. In fact, there's a number of different Methodist denominations that they've broken into, broken, divided, and actually grown thereby. Both were greatly used of God. Both were, let me just say, I think maybe both had their blind spots, but God uses broken people, and He uses them in a mighty way.